Hey everyone, I realized that last time I filmed it vertically, so I'm doing it horizontally now, and I hope that that'll upload to YouTube better since I'm not doing it on YouTube Shorts. So anyway, this is the second episode in my book review series, other than my welcome post. So the book that I'm going to be going over is a nonfiction as well. It is survival. It is narrated basically within one time frame instead of over many years. It's a very interesting, great book about the African slave trade, which was an unfortunate, probably one of the worst things to ever happen to the planet. So the book is Zorg, or The Zorg. And the author is Sindrad Kenra. I'm sorry if I obliterated that. I don't know how to say that. The full title is The Zorg, A True Story of Maritime Greed and the Birth of the Abolition Movement. They mean the abolition movement in England. And I'll read the back to you now as I did last time. In the late 18th century, a slave ship crossed the Atlantic carrying hundreds of enslaved Africans in conditions of unimaginable cruelty. What happened aboard that vessel would shock the world and help ignite one of history's most important human rights movements. The Zorg reveals the true story behind this maritime tragedy, exposing the brutal realities of the transatlantic slave trade. A Dutch slave ship overtaken by greed, the Zorg's fateful voyage pushed human exploitation to horrifying limits. When hundreds of Africans were murdered for profit, the resulting legal battle in Britain uncovered shocking evidence of cruelty and corruption, sparking outrage and fueling the rise of the abolitionist movement, forever altering the world's view on slavery. So the story here that takes place is, let me find the year. I could not remember the year. They show some maps. Great maps. Yeah, 1781. There you go. So anyway, the book, it starts with an explanation of what the African slave trade was. So what they would do is that mostly British and Dutch, sometimes French slavers, would go to the coasts of these African countries. They would set up little small fortresses or bastions or whatever you want to call them, and they would put about 50 or 100 soldiers in them with a governor, and they would have their slave ships check into these fortresses, and they would have slaves brought to them by African tribal leaders. Yeah, the slaves that they gave them were mostly captured after warfare or sold because of debts or something like that. The Europeans didn't really go into the inland to look for slaves themselves. It explains the really horrifying process of evaluating the worth of the slave. They would clean them, they would do all this, and the captain and the ship's surgeon would go out and buy them at auctions, and what they would use for the currency was gold dust, which was very abundant and worth a lot in that time period. They didn't have a common currency, so they didn't use that. They just used gold dust. The Zorg, they call it the Zong in British documents, but the author, for some reason, has a really weird fixation on calling it the actual name, even though it doesn't really matter. It had over about 300 slaves in total, in a ship that was built for maybe 240. It was not a very good lineup of the amount of slaves that the ship could have. It was crewed by a very small group of men. One of them was named Luke Collingwood. He was the captain and the former surgeon. He was not really prepared for navigation, so he left the matters of navigation to his first mate, James Kelsall, but he was very experienced as the ship's surgeon in identifying the health of the slaves and keeping the slaves alive, which is what the owners of their company in London wanted them to do. So overall, I'll give you the summary of the book. The author goes into a lot of detail about the actual transatlantic slave trade itself, and then she shortens the horizon a little bit and goes into the Zorg itself. So in a ship very, very packed with African slaves, they had a couple mates, a couple officers, and like 15 crew members, and that is drastically limited because the crew falsely believed that they had loaded too few amounts of water. And one of the horrifying facts about that is that they would not load enough water for the entire group of people on the ship, but they did that to save money because they knew that certain amounts of slaves and maybe a couple crew would perish on the way because of the horrifying conditions. That is really a horrible fact that I learned about that. I knew a little bit about this, but it really broadened my horizons about the transatlantic slave trade. Luke Collingwood eventually does die on this. Here's an interesting passage that I've bookmarked here. Of the 9,945 British slave voyages throughout the entire Atlantic slave trade that departed Africa, only 233 carried more than 440 slaves on board, and only 8 of the ships had a carrying capacity under 110 tons. One of those ships was the Zorg. So, essentially, she was very overpacked and she was undercrewed. Now, this didn't result in an African mutiny or anything like that because the slave ships were very well protected from that sort of thing, but it did lead to drastic water shortages. So as they're making their way from, I believe it was Guinea, all the way to Jamaica, which is where they're meant to drop them off, the captain, Luke Collingwood dies of illness on the journey, and Robert Stubbs, who was the disgraced former governor of one of the slave colonies, he was a passenger. Anyway, he takes command over James Kelsall, the first mate, and he dismisses Kelsall because he's kind of jealous of his navigational capabilities. But at this point, because so many of the crew are dead, he's forced to put Kelsall back in command of the navigation of the voyage. So Stubbs falsely estimates, he screws up the estimation of where they are, and he believes that they're near Hispaniola, which is a Spanish colony, and which will take them captive if they ever land there because they're at war with Spain right now. Remember, this is about the time of the American Revolution. So what he does is he sails past that island because he wants to find Jamaica, and he just ends up sailing into the ocean blue, and then he turns around because he realizes fucked up. He realizes his mistake, but it's already too late. So what unfortunately happens is that first of all, what they say they did was they threw about 110 slaves overboard the ship to drown in the sea because they said they didn't have enough water. But two of the damning facts in that case is that not only did they have enough water, they also had a rain a couple nights before that they were able to catch a lot of buckets full of water with. So that was just completely off the table. And what eventually is discovered by the court is that these crew members murdered the slaves for profit because they would get the insurance money from them. I guess they didn't think they'd sell enough in Kingston, Jamaica. So when they return, the very few men that do survive, Stubbs and Kelsall testify, and their testimony reaches the hands of an unknown author who's later revealed in the end of the book by the author's research. And they write an account of the transatlantic slave trade that makes headlines across England, and it leads to an insurance claim by the owners of the ship over the slaves, and the insurance company hires a lawyer to fight against them, and it eventually becomes a slavery versus anti-slavery case, and it really does push the limits of the transatlantic slave trade because they have to argue that they're cargo and not human beings, which of course they are human beings. And it eventually does lead to the abolition of the slave trade in England, and it was helped along by a very cool African guy who was living in England at the time. He was bartering his passage, I believe. Let me find his name. His name was Oliadu. I'm probably butchering that. Yeah. Oliadu. Here is a message from the Cornwall Chronicle in Jamaica. The Zorgu, note the bad pronunciation, Captain Collingwood from Africa, arrived lately at the Black River in great distress. After a passage of nearly 4 months from the coast, they were driven by a strong current to the leeward of the island, which is the opposite side of the island, and their water became nearly expended, and they were reduced to the deplorable necessity of throwing upwards of 130 of the slaves overboard, as the only probable means of preserving the lives of the crew and the remainder of the cargo. The remainder of the cargo. That's just an insane, evil thing to believe about another human being. But anyway, the tribe the trial eventually does become an anti-slavery matter. It evolves from an insurance claim, and it goes to the highest court of England, and it goes to a man named Mansfield, and he was previously inclined to slavery, but he eventually does rule in the matter of the slaves, and he declares that it was not payout. They could not pay out for murdering slaves. And because of that, it eventually does become way too expensive to do the slave trade, so it declines. But then eventually, because of the momentum that this case has established, a lot of abolition writers are able to print documents which argue against slavery and get the popularity of a bill ending slavery in England to pass, although it doesn't end in the British colonies just yet. One of the main supporters of that bill was Benjamin Franklin, who was writing from America in support of it. So that's really the book. That's really the broad overview of the book. I didn't go into it as much as I did on the other book, Unbroken, as I did a couple days ago. But I really think you guys should check out this book. It is absolutely worth the price. Once again, I got this at Half Price Books, so I don't know the actual price if you want to buy on Amazon or something. But if it is nearby, I would go into the store and buy it because it's a lot cheaper. This is a really harrowing book. It's kind of hard to get through sometimes because it just treats people, it shows the treatment of these people in absolutely horrible conditions, and I did not imagine that the transatlantic slave trade was as bad as the book says it was. So this book has given me a lot to think about, more than probably any other book that I've read in the last couple years. Is absolutely worth the price. I'd give it a 10 out of 10. It's a very cool narrative, of the whole. What I loved about it was at the end, it goes through a whole timeline of the transatlantic slave trade bill to end it, and they talk about all the pamphlets and all the cases that they win. And after such a horrible first part of the book, not horrible in writing style, but horrible in just the atrocities that happen in it, I think it's great that we get to see the end of that kind of firsthand. And then, by original research, the writer of the pamphlet who originally wrote the anti-slavery thing that led to the trial was revealed as, I believe it was a man named Roberts. Let me check that. Let me see. James Ramsey, my bad. His name was James Ramsey. And basically, because of this letter, not only does it end slavery in England, but further laws end the whole slave trade in the empire, meaning India and all the other things, although India does have a later on our battle with slavery themselves. All right, I think that's about it. I've gone over the summary of the book. I've gone about what I loved about it, the prose. Sindrad Kenra is an amazing author. I definitely want to read more of their books, if they have any. I would really recommend that you guys check this out. This is the Zorg. Thank you for coming, guys. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Good night.